Alright, round two with a homemade cookie tin gas tank. This is for my 3.5 horsepower Witte. I've already cleaned the tank and everything. I've cut a hole and bent out the little flange fingers to hold this filler neck on. I've already got the hole drilled over here for the fuel line to go in. So I'm going to solder this up. The old tank wasn't in very good shape. It wasn't the right one, and it's all banged up, and there was a bunch of junk in it. I didn't feel like getting the check valve clogged all the time with a dirty fuel tank, and I couldn't quite clean it out. So I'll adjust my propane torch. Nice torch with a flexible hose. Heat from the bottom. So you get kind of an indirect heat. Solder melting, wicking in there. You can see it. Oh, caught on fire a little bit. That's that. Probably could have had the torch a little bit cooler, but it's okay. There's a little warp over here. I think that'll flatten out. Looks good to me. Alright, next step is to solder all the joints on the bottom piece. Alright, time to solder up the bottom. I ran a little bead of flux with my syringe of flux. Now I'm going to cut some pieces of solder, flux core solder, and I'll position them all around. I prefer more solder as opposed to less. I don't want it leaking after I put it together. So I got maybe a 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch piece of solder, spacing them maybe 1 inch apart. That's about good. Definitely looks like a lot of solder. All right. Grab a glove so I can turn it with one hand while I'm soldering it with the other. So I can just keep the torch over here and spin it around. Learn from the lid, I'm going to turn my torch down a little bit so I don't warp it. Let's see what that does. Heat from the bottom. Move it a little bit so you don't get a hot spot. Having the torch a little cooler definitely is making it better. The flux isn't catching on fire, and I'm not overheating and discoloring the metal. I'm not really warping it. As you see, I'm tilting the cookie tin to kind of let the solder flow right into the corner as opposed to spreading out all over the bottom. That's that. Now onto the seams. Alright, so I soldered the bottom, then off camera I touched it up a little bit. There wasn't quite enough solder to my liking. Cleaned it up with some carburetor cleaner and a wire brush. And now let's flux the vertical seam. Cut off a couple pieces of solder. Get that flame just right. Move that flame back and forth, heat everything nice and even. So that solder wet in real nice. Oh, a little too hot. That's one side. Alright, fix up the other side. That's that. All right, everything's all soldered up except we need to solder the top onto the bottom. So I soaked this overnight in water, partly to loosen all the flux that had caked in here, and partly to check to make sure there were no leaks or anything, which there weren't. And just a little bit of water. So I cleaned this edge with carburetor cleaner, and I cleaned the inside rim of the lid with carburetor cleaner. Now I'll flux everything up. Like so. Pop the lid on. In this particular case, the orientation of the lid doesn't matter. On my rectangular tank, it did matter. There we go, everything's fluxed up. It's rested in my vise. In this case, I can't, put pieces of solder down because they're all going to fall off, so I just got to feed it in as I go. Just my flame. Heating up a little bit more metal, a little bit more mass this time, so I'll give it a little bit more flame. If you notice, the sheet metal isn't making too much thumping and bumping as it expands and contracts and warps, which means that we're not putting too much heat in. This particular solder is 062 diameter, 6040 composition. The rosin core flux. Well, I've come full circle. I'm gonna let that cool off a little bit. Then I'm gonna scrape off all the little bits. There's some little pieces of solder that broke off, melted off, so I'm gonna clean those off, clean the flux off, and I'm gonna reassess, leak check it, put the lid on and cover that with my finger, put some water in it and see if anything leaks out. And then that will be a completed tank. Clean it up a little bit. I'm going to leave it shiny. I prefer the shiny look. I believe it's plated, so it's not going to rust or anything, and if it does, I'll paint it. It's no big deal. All right, last step in making the new gas tank for my 3.5 horsepower Witte. Got it all soldered up. I leak checked this joint from the lid to the base, and it did leak a little bit. I just filled it up with water, put the cap on, put my finger over this hole, and I just sloshed it around and found a couple leaks, soldered them up. Now it's completely leak free, so time to mount it. I looked around online, and the closest original thing I could come up with to mount it looked like there were some little bracket sort of things that held down the gas tank, sort of like this. So I made a couple of these little double L brackets. There's a hole in one end, just a foot on the other, and it just goes like so. You put a screw through there or a lag bolt or something, and it tightens the tank down onto the skid. I made this height just a little bit less than the tank, and I also have these little pieces of rubber that I cut out of a piece of inner tube. They're maybe 3/32 thick or something like that, I don't know. I already drilled the holes in the skid for the screws. I used, this is a pretty handy tool, a right angle drill. It really helps to get into those tight spaces, especially the screw way back here, kind of behind the magneto or underneath it. So that's all I have to say about how it goes on. The other important thing is that the fuel line will be removable for servicing or cleaning the check ball or whatever. It'll be removable without removing the gas tank. And you see the gas tank, this is about the position it's going to be in. Drop the fuel line in there, swing it around, and then it can screw onto the needle valve on the carburetor. Right here. So the fuel line can be taken out easily, and the fuel tank can be taken out just with the removal of 2 screws. There's 4 of these feet, but if you take off the 2 front ones, you can just slide the tank right out. So I'm going to loosely screw the fuel line in. I did make some marks on the skid for alignment of the tank, but I washed those away with carburetor cleaners. I didn't want to see the Sharpie marks, and I also got kind of carried away and I covered the whole thing with linseed oil, since I think this is the original skid. And I wanted to get linseed oil between the tank and the skid since it's going to be covered. But I'll just line it up by eye. Just make sure it's aligned this way and that way. And get the filler neck right in the middle, which it is. And this feels like it's about in the middle between the 2 skids this way. So now all I need to do is screw these down, put a little piece of rubber underneath it. I'm going to screw them all down loosely, and then I will gradually tighten them once I make sure everything's in place. And I just oiled this screw that it's going in there because it's a little bit rusty and it's a small, kind of a tight hole. I'll screw that down in there. These are just regular, I don't know what you call them, pan head, round head screws. So it's tight. I'm just going to back it off just a little bit so it's loose. The next one. Oil that. I buy WD-40 by the gallon and put it in these spray bottles. It's a lot better than using those cans with those stupid smart straws. Not too smart to me. 2 more. That in there. Got a better screwdriver for this. Got some better reach. Don't have to be bending over. Get that tightened down, and I'll slip the piece of rubber under it. I'm using the rubber partly as a spacer and partly as anti-wear and shock absorption. There, and that's about all there is to it. Of course, I haven't tightened everything down yet, but you don't need to see that. You get the idea. That's about it. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it looks pretty stock. The original tanks were a little bit larger in diameter and maybe a little bit in height, but there isn't much room to work with between the bottom of the head and the top of the tank. And also on the originals, the fuel line, rather than doing a little jig, it just goes straight down into the tank. But to do that, the tank would have to be offset because this tank isn't big enough. That's why I put that bend in it. That isn't original looking, but I'm not that concerned about it being original. It looks original enough, and part of the beauty of these engines is the creativity of the fixes that they get over their lifetime of 70 years or 100 years. They get a lot of use, a lot of abuse, and sometimes they break because they're mechanical, and you got to fix them, and sometimes you can't always buy the original parts. You got to make do with what you have. So anyway, that's it. That's what it looks like. Looks pretty good to me. It looks a lot better than the original tank. This was the original tank. Some old piece of junk. Cap was all messed up, and that big filler neck there. That looks a lot nicer. So anyway, thanks for watching. Leave a comment, leave a suggestion, and as always, come back for more.